So in this video, I want us to begin working on the messages page. But before we get to that, I want to go ahead and fix a few things because I realized that we were having an issue with our photo uploads. And then on the notifications page as well, we have a small issue with just some spelling. So let's go ahead and fix that before we jump into the messages page. So in the notifications page, this is probably just for me, because I realized that I misspelled something even though I thought that I had caught all the misspells, but I had misspelled this right here. So it should say notification, and then just to make sure that I don't have any other, so notification, I don't have any other issue. So let's go ahead and save that. And then I had a markdown file here that I titled to fix. So what I've just done is this one, so I can remove it. And then on the post form component, I misspelled the class name prop. So in the components and then post form, I can just search for class NAE. That's what I misspelled it as. So right here, class name with an M. And once again, probably you don't have this issue. But now the issue that probably you have is the one about the uploads. So I realized, and let me demonstrate it first of all. If we are on the home page and then we try to upload a photo, so just grab this and then I'm just going to select this as a photo. You can see that it is called slide 16-9. So if I select it, you can check the console, and in the console in the localhost tab, you can see that we get this big error. Now this error is saying something like it is sending a pre-signed URL correctly, but when it tries to get the route so that it can serve the image, then it's saying it fails to register the metadata. So the way that you can fix that, or rather the workaround that I've got for that, is to go ahead and run the development server in production. So you can go ahead and say Node.js, because we're using Node.js. You can set the server to run in production, though this is not recommended, but we're going to use it just to demonstrate the photo uploads. Otherwise, we would have to deploy this into something like Vercel, and that's quite a long process that I don't want to do now, but we're going to do it at the end of the project. So we're going to use this command in order to test this out, because if you were to go ahead and log into upload thing in the files tab right here, when I reload it, you'll notice that I have uploaded a new file called slide 16-9, and I uploaded it on July 28th at 7:23 p.m., which is 2 minutes ago, as you can see from the time right here. So upload thing is receiving the file, but it is not being served to our Next.js application. So in order to circumvent that, therefore, we are going to shut down our terminal and clear the terminal. And what we're going to do is we're going to say node dash or the underscore env is equal to production, and then we're going to run pnpm run dev or pnpm dev, so that now our development server, you can see that it says this is non-standard. So just to demonstrate that our upload is working, we are going to do this. Now when it opens up, we can reload the page. So once it reloads, we can now go ahead and try to upload it again. So I'm just going to select the same image, and then when it uploads, we should receive a toast notification, because that's how we set it up in our front end. And in the back end, I can actually open this up. We should not have any issues, but we do. We still get an issue here. So we're still getting back an issue, and I don't know why that did not work, but I tested it out earlier and it was working. But the reason why we're getting this huge error is because this key right here, is dev, is set to true. So because of that, it's just having trouble with Next.js and all that. And I thought this would bypass it because I tested it out earlier, but now it's not working and I don't know why. So therefore, what I'm going to do is this. We might have to deploy this in order to test out our image upload. We might have to do just that, but I don't want to do it right away. Instead, I want us to go ahead and just jump into the messages tab so that we can build out the rest of the application. And then when we deploy it, then we're going to be able to test this out. Because if you go ahead and check your backend for the upload thing, you'll notice that even the image that you upload has already been uploaded. And probably you don't even have this issue. So probably it's just on my end. I mean, it happens. So therefore, this is what we're going to do. We're going to close all of this out. And once again, because this is a new day of recording, just make sure that the convex tab is, or that the convex terminal is running pnpx convex dev so that your convex backend is running. And then also ensure that you have localhost running. So let's jump into messages. We should get a 404 error. And this should shrink down, and then this should open up on the side so that we can build side by side. So in the app page, we're going to create a new file here called messages/page.jsx, which will create the folder and then the file called page.jsx, and then we can begin building. Now this is going to be a client component, and it has quite a number of imports, and I'm going to be using auto imports for that so that we don't spend like 10 minutes importing everything. So I'm going to go ahead and say export default function messages page, and then we're going to have some state value here. So const user and set user is equal to use state, and then enter to auto import it. So that's what we're going to be doing throughout this entire page because it is quite a huge page. Then const following and set following. This is going to be equal to use state. By default, it is going to be an empty array. And then let's just copy this down a few more times. The next one is going to say selected user, and then set selected user. By default, this is going to be null. And then next, we're going to have messages, and set messages. And then this is going to be an empty array by default. And then next, we have set new message. So set new message, and then new message. And by default, it is going to be an empty array. And then next we have loading and set loading. By default, it is going to be true. And then next we have sending message, and set sending message. And by default, this is going to be false because we are not going to be sending a message when you open up a new chat. And then finally, we're going to have unread counts, and then set unread counts. And by default, this is going to be an object. And then we don't need the rest of these state values. And then now we just need to get convex. So const convex is equal to use convex from convex react. And then const router is equal to use router from next navigation. And then we're going to say const and then destructure the user as kind user because user is already being used here. And then want to get is authenticated. And then want to get is loading. This is coming from use kind browser client like so. And then we're going to begin to set up our use effect, enter to auto import it, set up our callback function. And then inside here, we're going to say if is loading is true, we're going to return. And this is something similar that we've done in other pages, so you should be familiar with it. And then we're going to say if not is authenticated, then we want to say router.push and redirect them back to the home page so that they're able to log in and then return so that you can break out of that. Otherwise, we're going to say const load data is equal to, this is going to be an asynchronous function, and we're going to have a try catch block here. So for the try block, we're going to say const user data is equal to await convex dot query, and then we're querying the API which we need to import from convex generated API dot auth dot get current user, which is a function that we already have. And then we're going to pass in the kind ID as the kind user !ID. And then below this, once that loads in, we're going to say if there is no user data, then we're going to say router.push and want to redirect them back to the home page and then we're going to say return. So now if there is user data, then we're going to say set user into the user data, which is now going to populate this first state value. Now once we do this, we only want to get the mutual follows of the user, so that you are only able to send messages to someone who follows you back. So we're going to say this is going to get mutual follows, and then I'm going to say const following users, so the users that you follow, is equal to await convex dot query, and then we're going to pass in API dot users dot get following, which is a function that you don't have, and then this is going to be taking in the user ID as user data dot underscore ID. So because it's going to be easier, and because this is also a huge file, we're going to be creating the functions as we come across them. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the users.js, and what I've done there is Control P and then just search for the users file. It is much easier. And then inside this file, we're going to go right below this, and then we're going to create this function that is called get following. So export const get following is equal to, and this is a query, and we're going to be taking in the user ID, and not, we're supposed to first pass in the arguments and then user ID, and this is coming from v.id from the users table. And then our handler function is going to be asynchronous, passing in the context and then the arguments, and then we're going to say const follows is equal to await context.db.query, and we are querying the follows table, and we are querying it with index of by follower, and then we're going to pass in our callback function here, where we're going to say query.equals and then pass in the follower ID and compare it with the arguments.user ID that is passed in, and then dot collect, so that we get the number of followers, or rather you get all the followers. And then const following is equal to await promise dot all, and then pass in the follows dot map, and then this is going to be asynchronous, and then for every follow that we get back, we're going to open this up and say return await context.db.get, and then pass in the follow dot following ID. Now once we do that, right below this, we're going to say return following dot filter, and then pass in boolean, so that it only gets the ones that we are following. So that is our get following function. So you can save that and then jump back into the JSX, and then we can continue building. So below this, we're going to say const mutual follows is going to be equal to an empty array, and then we're going to loop over the followed user. So const followed user of following users, which is the variable that we're just getting right here, and I'm having trouble typing it. So const followed user, which is a new variable that we're creating of following users, which we already have on top. Then we're going to say const is following back is equal to await convex dot query, and then pass in API dot users dot is following, which is another function that we need to create. So is following, and then this is going to be taking the follower ID, which is coming from followed user dot underscore ID, and then the following ID is coming from the user data dot underscore ID, like so. Now below this, we're going to say if is following back. So if it is true, then we want to add them to our mutual follows by saying mutual follows dot push, and then pass in the followed user, like so. Now below our if right here and below this other curly bracket, we're going to say set following into the mutual follows, like so. So that now it is going to populate our state value. Now before we create this function, let's go ahead and continue building this so that we don't jump between files too much. So now we need to get the unread messages for each user. So get unread messages count for each user, so that we can display it like this user has a certain number of unread messages. So we're going to say const unread counts data is equal to an empty object, like so. and then we're going to once again create a for loop. So const followed user of mutual follows. Now we're going to say const count is equal to await convex dot query pass in API dot messages dot get unread count. Now we don't have this file and don't have this function, so we're going to create it. This is going to be taking the user ID as user data dot underscore ID, and then the other user ID as the followed user dot underscore ID. Now below this, we're going to say that if the count is greater than 0, then we want to go ahead and say unread counts data, and then open this up. We're going to pass in the followed user dot underscore ID and set this equal to the count. And then below this, we're going to go ahead and say set unread counts into the unread counts data. And then for the catch block, we're going to say toast.error, and then we're going to say error loading data. And then we're going to have a finally block here, which is going to say set loading into false. Now, as always, remember to call your function, and it is ending right here because I remember that it was beginning with a yellow bracket. So we're going to go ahead and say load data like so. And then for the use effect, this is going to be taking in the dependencies array or the dependency arrays of convex, and then router, and then kind user, and then is authenticated and is loading. So if any of these change, then our entire function is going to rerun. So let's go ahead and jump into the users folder. So right here, or rather the users file, and then let's create the is following. So export const is following is equal to a query, and then this is going to be taking in some arguments, and the arguments for this is going to be the follower ID. So follower ID is coming from v.id from the users table, and then it's taking the following ID, once again coming from v.id from the users table. And then our handler function is going to be asynchronous, taking the context and the arguments, and then we're going to say the following: const follow is equal to await context dot db dot query, and we are querying the follows table, and we're querying it with index of by relationship, and then passing our callback function here. So query dot equals, and then we're going to pass in the follower ID, and then arguments dot follower ID, and then once again dot equals the following ID, and then pass in the arguments dot following ID. Don't mess that up. Don't mess that up. And then we're going to call first like so that it gets the first one that matches, and then we're going to return exclamation follow. So just to turn this into a boolean so that we can get whether they are following or not. Now we can go ahead and save that, but the next function we need in the messages, because we need to get this file and then this function right there. So inside convex, we're going to go ahead and create a new file called messages.js, and inside messages we're going to create a function here called export const get unread count. This is going to be equal to a query which can auto import from /generated server, and then this is going to be taking some arguments here. So it's going to be taking the user ID, which is coming from v.id from the users table, and then it also takes in the other user ID, which is coming from v.id from the users table again. And then our handler function is an asynchronous function taking the context and the arguments, where you can say const conversation ID is equal to, open this up, square brackets, arguments dot user ID, comma, arguments dot other user ID, and then we want to dot sort, and then dot join, and join it with a separator of a hyphen. And then we're going to say const unread messages is equal to await context.db.query, and we are querying the messages table. We're querying it with index of by conversation, and then passing our callback function here, where we're going to say query.equals, and then pass in the conversation ID, and then outside of this we're going to say dot filter, And then we want to filter once again with a query here. We're going to say q.and then pass in q.equals and then pass in q.field, and then inside the field we're going to pass in the receiver ID, and then outside of this first bracket we're going to say arguments.user ID, and then outside of this other bracket we're going to say comma query.equals, and then open this up and say query.field, and then we're going to pass in the red field, and you want to search outside of this. You want to check whether the message is red or false. Now once I save this, first of all have .collect. Once I save it, it's going to be properly formatted so that you are able to see it better. And then we're going to say return unread messages.length, like so. So save that. So it's a bit convoluted, but that's how you get unread messages. And then we can go ahead and continue building up this file. Now if you want to get rid of this error because it's becoming a bit annoying, just simply have a return here that says messages, just so that you can get rid of that, so that it doesn't have to reload every single time. So once we're done with this use effect, we're going to create another use effect. We're going to have a callback function here, and inside this use effect we're going to say if selected user and there's a user also, then we're going to call a function here called load messages. Now load messages is a function that we don't yet have, but we're going to create it. So once we do that, then we want to enable real-time messaging so that when a user messages you on one side, you're going to receive it immediately without having to reload the page. So we're going to say const interval is equal to set interval, and then we're going to go ahead and open this up, and we're going to call the load messages function, and we're going to call it after every 2 seconds, which is 2000 milliseconds. Now the reason why we do this is so that it is going to call this function every 2 seconds so that you don't have to reload the page. And then once you do that, we will need to return a cleanup function. So return and clear interval, and then clear the interval of interval, like so. And then this is going to have some dependency arrays, so it's going to depend on the selected user and the user as well. Now once you do that, we actually need to go ahead and create this function. So below this we're going to say const load messages. This is going to be an asynchronous function, and we're going to open this up and say if there is no selected user, or there is no user at all, then return. And then we're going to have our try catch block, so that means that there is a user, so we have our try catch block. For the catch block, we're going to say console.error, and we're going to say error loading messages, and then pass in the error.message, and then we're going to have a toast notification, so toast.error, and then we're going to say an error occurred when loading your messages, and then close this out. And then we don't have a finally block for this one, so we can go ahead and deal with our try block. So for the try block, we're going to say const messages data is equal to await convex.query, and then pass in the api.messages.get messages, which is a function that we don't have, but you can open this up. It's going to be taking the user ID as the user ._ID. It's going to be taking the other user ID as the selected user ._ID. And then once you do that, then we're going to say set messages, which is our state value, into the messages data that we get back from convex. Now once you do that, we want to create a function that is going to mark all the messages as read. So mark all messages as read, and we're going to say await convex.mutation, and then pass in api.messages.mark messages as read. There's a function that we're going to create. It is going to be taking the user ID as user._ID, and then other user ID as selected user._ID. And then once we do that, then we need to update the number of unread messages. So we're going to say set unread counts, and then take in the previous value, and then you can open this up and say const updated. So the updated is equal to, and open up the object and then spread out the previous value, and then I'm going to say delete updated, and then open this up and pass in the selected user dot underscore id, and then this should say delete, not deleted. So delete, and then return updated, like so. And this is our entire function for load messages. And then below this, we're going to create a function called handle send message. This is going to be an asynchronous function. And then I'm going to say if there's no new message dot trim, because remember that new message is our state value, which is a string. Wait a minute. And I made a mistake here. This should be a string, not an empty array. And user here should be null. What was I doing when typing this out? And then let's jump back to the bottom. So if there's no new message.trim, or there's no selected user, or there's no user, then you want to return. And then we're going to say if there's a user, therefore then set sending message into true, so that we can have some kind of state of the button. And then we're going to have our try catch block. So for the catch block, we're going to say toast.error, then pass in failed to send message. And then we're going to have a finally block here, where we're going to say set sending message to false, and then we're going to call load messages again, which is our function that we've just created on top. So in the try block, we're going to say await convex.mutation, and then pass in api.messages.send message. Once again, we don't have this function, we're going to create it. This is going to be taking the sender ID as the user.underscore ID, and then the receiver ID, receiver ID is going to be the selected user dot underscore ID, and then the content of the message is going to say new message, which is our state value, dot trim, so that it removes any extra spaces at the end of the text. And then I'm going to say set new message into an empty string, so basically just reset it. Next, we're going to have a function here called const handle user select. This is going to be an asynchronous function, and this is going to be taking in the selected followed user, so the user whom you select, and we're going to say set selected user into the selected followed user, just simple like that. And then the next function is called format time. So format time, this is going to be taking in the timestamp, so equals timestamp, and then we're going to open that up, and we're going to say const date is equal to new date, and then pass in the timestamp, and then const now is equal to new date, like so, and then const difference in hours, so diff in hours is equal to now minus the date, which I've just noticed I've misspelled, so this should say date, not data. And then divide this by 1000, or rather open this up, 1000 times 60 times 60. And then below this, we're going to say if the difference in hours, so if diff in hours is less than 24, then we want to format the date a certain way. So we're going to say return date dot to local time string, and then open this up and pass in the square brackets and then comma, and then open up an object. We're going to set the hour into 2 digits, so we want to show 2 digits as the hours, and then the minute I've just written it the way I'm speaking it, so 2 digit as well. And then below this right here, so this is a semicolon, and then below this we're going to say return date dot to local date string, so. And then we want to check if is loading or loading is true. Then we want to go ahead and say return, so we're going to return our loading spinner component, just like so. And this time the messages page is different from the other pages, so we don't need the main layout. And then now we can begin to work on our return. So the div right here is going to have a class name of min height dash screen, and then bg white, and then on dark mode we're going to say bg gray dash 900. And then inside here we're going to have another div with a class name of mx auto, and then flex, and then height dash screen, and max width dash 7xl. And then inside this div we're going to have another div with a class name of flex and width dash 80, and then flex dash column, and then border dash right, and then border dash gray dash 200, and then on dark mode we're going to say border dash gray, so border dash gray dash 800. And then inside this div we're going to have our header, which is basically the header for the chart, and we're going to say class name of border dash bottom, and then border dash gray dash 200, and then padding all around the 4, and then on dark mode border dash gray dash 800. And then inside this we're going to have another div with a class name of margin bottom of 4, and then flex, and then item dash center, and then justify dash between, and then inside this div we're going to have a button component with a variant of ghost. And then when you click on this button, you want to go ahead and call router.back so that it takes us back to the previous page. And then inside this button we're going to be showing the arrow left icon from Lucid React. This is going to have a class name of size-5, and then below this button we're going to have a div with a class name of flex, and then items-center, and then space on the x of 3. And then inside this div we're going to have another div with a class name of rounded-full, and then bg blue-500, and then padding all round of 2. And then inside this div we're going to have the Twitter icon. So Twitter icon from Lucid React, it is going to have a class name of size-6, and then text-white, and then close that out. And then below this div we're going to have an h1 with a class name of text-xl, and then font-bold, and then text gray-900, and then on dark mode we're going to say text-white, and then the text for the h1 is going to say messages. So you can save that, and let's see what you have on the screen. So you have an issue here, and it is because of the functions that we have not created. Load message, it should be load messages plural, right? Where is it? Load messages, like so. So this has now redirected me back to the home page, but we want the messages page. And there we go. So that is our header, because that I forgot to style it out for mobile versions, but that's okay. So let's have it as full screen so that we're able to see the entire thing, and then we can maximize this. And then when you go back to the bottom, we can go below the h1 and then below 2 divs, and then we're going to create another div with a class name of relative. And then inside this we're going to have a search icon from Lucid React. This search icon is going to have a class name of absolute, and then top-1/2, and then left-3, and size-4, and then minus translate on the y-axis by 1/2, and then transform, and then text gray-400, and then close this out. And then below the search we're going to have an input component from components UI input. It is going to have a placeholder that says search for people, and then the class name for this is going to say rounded-full, then border-none, then -none, then bg gray-100, padding on the left of 10, and then on dark mode we're going to say bg gray-800, and then close that out as well. And then below 1 div 2 div we're going to go ahead and create our following list. So following list. So below this we're going to go ahead and create a scroll area component, which is coming from components UI scroll area once again, and I think this is the first time that we are using this component. So this is going to have a class name of flex-1, and what this component does basically is that it just creates a scroll list for you so that you don't have to like scroll the entire page. So just basically creates like a scroll list depending on where you use it. So the scroll area here, inside this we're going to have a class name of divide-y, and then divide-gray-200, and then on dark mode we're going to say divide-gray-800. And then inside here we want to go ahead and check for the following. If the following.length is equal to 0, and if this is true, we're going to show something, and then if it is false, we're also going to show something. So for the true statement here, we're going to say return a div, the class name of padding on the x of 4, padding on the y of 8, and then text-center. And then inside this div, we're going to show the mail icon, enter to auto import it. It's going to have a class name of mxauto, margin bottom of 4, then size -12, and then text gray -400, and then close it out. And then below the mail icon, we're going to have an h3 with a class name of margin bottom of 2, font -medium, text gray -900, and then on dark mode, text -white, and then the text is going to say no mutual follows. And then below the h3, we're going to have a paragraph with a class name of text-sm, text gray -500, and then on dark mode, we're going to say text gray -400, and then the text is going to say you can only message people who follow you back. And then that is going to be it for that. And now we can deal with our else here. So if the length is 0, then we are showing this div. Otherwise, we want to go ahead and map over the follower. So following dot map, and then for every followed user that we get back, we're going to go ahead and return the following. We're going to return a card, and then because we're mapping over this, we're going to have a key here of followed user dot underscore id. So get the unique id for every user from convex. This is going to have a class name, and it's going to be dynamic, so pass in your curly brackets and then backticks, so cursor -pointer, and then rounded -none, then border -0, and then transition -colors, and then $sign curly brackets. We want to check for the selected user, question mark dot underscore id is equal to the followed user dot underscore id, meaning the users match, so we want to apply some classes here. So if this is true, then you want to apply the class name of bg-blue-50, and then on dark mode, bg-blue-900 with an opacity of 20, so meaning just to highlight the selected user. And then otherwise, on hover, we're going to say bg-gray-50, and then on dark mode, and on hover, then bg-gray-800, and then can close that out. So on click, this card is going to have an on click. Open this up. We're going to call the handle user select, and then pass in the followed user, and then close that out, and then can build our card content. So enter to auto import it. I don't know whether I imported the card, so control spacebar, enter, auto import it. The card content is going to close like so, but inside it, we're going to have a div with a class name of flex, and then items-center, and then space on the x of 3, and then inside this div, we're going to have the avatar component from components UI avatar. It's going to have a class name of size-12, and then inside the avatar, we're going to have avatar image, components UI avatar, enter to auto import it. The source for this is going to be the followed user dot avatar, not underscore, and then close this out. It is going to have a class name of object-cover, and then below this, we're going to have the avatar fallback, so avatar fallback. So in case the image fails to load, then we're going to go ahead and say get user initials, which is a function that we created quite a while ago. So get user initials, and get it from libutils, and then pass in the followed user dot name. And is this imported? Okay. And then below the avatar, so below the avatar component, we're going to have a div with a class name of min width -0, and then flex -1, and then inside this, we're going to have another div with a class name of margin bottom of 1, and then flex, and then item-center, and then justify -between, and then we're going to have a paragraph inside here with a class name of truncate, and then font truncate, then font -medium, and then text gray -900, and then on dark mode, we're going to say text -white, and then the text here is going to be showing the followed user dot name, so the name of the user. And then below the paragraph, we're going to go ahead and say the unread counts, and then pass in the followed user, so followed user dot underscore id, and this is inside square brackets. So basically pass in the number of unread messages for the user, and then we're going to say if that is true, then we're going to open this up, and we're going to have a div with a class name of flex, and then size-5, then items-center, and then justify-center, and then rounded-full, and then bg-blue-500. And then inside this div, we're going to have a span with a class name of text-extra small, and then font-medium, and then text-white. And then the span is going to say unread counts, and then open this up, passing the followed user ._id, like so. So if we were to save this, we would see nothing on the screen because we don't have our convex functions yet. But we should be able to see our follows because I think I follow someone. Okay, no mutual follows yet. So let me just check if we're able to follow someone because I created another account in order to demonstrate the functionality. So I can click on this and no users found. Oh, sorry, no users found. So we don't have the profile page yet. That's the reason why, as you can see, we get a 404 page. But when we get to that, we'll be able to demonstrate it. So let's just continue building this out. So even though we are not going to be able to test it out, we're going to test it out once we build the profile page for the follows. So we're going to go below this div, and then we're going to create another div with a class name of truncate, and then text-sm, and then text-gray-900, and then on dark mode, we're going to say text-gray-400, and then this is going to say art, and then open up your curly brackets, followed user.username, so get their username, and then you can close out the entire card. You can go below the scroll area, and then below this div of the scroll area, and we want to build the message view. So the message view is going to be as follows. We're going to have a div with a class name of flex, and then flex-1, and then flex-column, and then inside here you want to check for the selected user. So if the selected user is true, then we're going to open up a fragment here. Otherwise, we're going to show something else. But now remember that we're not returning a div, we're returning a fragment. Just take note of that. Now inside the fragment, we want to go ahead and show the chart header first of all. So the chart header is going to have a div with a class name of border-bottom, and then border-gray-200, and then bg-white, and then the white is going to have an opacity of 80, and then padding all around of 4, and then backdrop-blur -md, and then on dark mode we're going to go ahead and say border-gray-800, and then on dark mode bg-gray-900 with an opacity of 80. And then inside this div, we're going to turn another div. So another div with a class name of flex, and then items-center, and then space on the x of 3. And then inside here, you want to return the avatar, which we have on top. So let's just go ahead and copy it. So copy the avatar and paste it inside here. Except now this is going to have a class name of size-10. This is going to be calling the selected user. So selected user.avatar, and then get user initials is going to say selected user dot name, and then save it so that it can be formatted properly. And then below the avatar, we're going to return a div. This div is going to have an h3 with a class name of font-medium, and then text gray-900, and then on dark mode we're going to say text white, and then this is going to be showing the selected user dot name, so the name of the user. And then below the h3, we're going to have a paragraph with a class name of text-small, and then text gray-500, and then on dark mode we're going to say text gray-400, and then we're going to say art, and then say selected user.username. Now below the paragraphs and then below these 3 divs, so we are still within the React fragment, we want to go ahead and show the messages of the user. So we're going to create a scroll area once again. So scroll area, and once again, just like I explained, the purpose for the scroll area is we're going to be able to scroll the messages without scrolling the entire website. So the scroll area is going to have a class name of height dash, and then calc, open this up first of all, calc height, so, and then pass in 100 viewport heights minus 200 pixels, so that it is going to show an almost full screen. and then it's going to have a class name of flex-1, and then padding all around of 4. My computer is lagging a bit. I hope it doesn't mess with the audio. And inside this scroll area, we're going to have a div with a class name of space on the y of 4, and inside here we're going to map over the messages. So messages.map, and then for every message that we get back, we're going to go ahead and open up a div. This div is going to have a key of message._id, and then the class name is going to be dynamic. So open up your curly brackets and then backticks. So it's going to say flex, and then $ curly brackets. Want to check for the message.sender_id and check if it is equal to the user._id. If that is true, then you want to apply the justify end class. Otherwise, you want to apply the justify start class. So basically just like a chart. So if you are the sender, then your messages are going to appear on the right, and if you're the receiver, or rather the receiver on the other end, is going to see the messages on the left. Now we can close that div right here, close it out, and then inside this div we're going to have another div, close it out, and this other div is going to have some dynamic class names as well. So class name is equal to, open this up, and we're going to say max width dash extra small, rounded dash large, padding on the x of 4, padding on the y of 2, and then on large screens max width dash md. And then we want to check, so $ curly bracket, if the message.sender_id is equal to the user._id, and if that is true, we want to apply bg-blue-500 as well as text-white, and then otherwise we're going to say bg-gray-200, and then text gray-900, and then on dark mode we're going to say bg gray-700, and then on dark mode we're going to say text-white. So basically saying that the messages that you send are going to be blue and the ones that you receive are going to be gray. And then inside this div, we're going to open that up. We're going to have a paragraph with a class name of text-small, where we're going to pass in the message.content. And then below this paragraph, we're going to have another paragraph with some dynamic class names. So class name, open this up. We want to say margin top of 1, text-extra small, and then $ curly bracket. We want to check for the message.sender_id is equal to sender_id is triple equal to the user._id. And if that is true, we want to apply the text-blue-100 class. Otherwise, we want to apply text-gray-500 class. And inside this paragraph, what we're going to be calling is the format time function. So format time, and then pass in the message.createdAt. Created at, because that is something that we have in our database. And then we can go below this scroll area, and then now we're going to be building the message input. So for the message input, we're going to have a div with a class name of border-top, and then border-gray-200, and then padding all around of 4, and then on dark mode we're going to say border-gray-800. And then inside this div, we're going to have another div with a class name of flex, and then space on the x of 2, and then we're going to have a text area component here from components UI text area. The placeholder for this is going to say start a new message, or maybe send a new message. So start a new message. The value for this is going to be the new message, which is our state value. And then on change, we're going to be calling e, and we're going to say set new message into e.target value. And then the class name for this is going to say flex-1, and then resize -none, so that you're not going to be able to resize the text area. And then the number of rows is going to be 1. And then on key press, the event, we're going to be accessing the synthetic event of e, and then we're going to open this up, and you want to check if the e that is pressed, so e.key is equal to enter. So if the key that is pressed is the enter key, and it is not the e plus the shift key. So if that is true, what we want to do is we want to say e.prevent default, so prevent the default behavior of reloading the entire page, and then we want to call the handle send message function. So basically, if you press the enter key, then trigger the handle send message function. and then the text area closes right here. And then below the text area, we're going to have a button component. This button is going to have an on click of handle send message. So when you click on it, it is going to send the message. The disabled state for this button is going to be depending on the not new message. So if there's no new message.trim, meaning it is an empty string, or sending message is true, because sending message is a state value which is a boolean. And then it is going to have some class names here. So class name bg-blue-500, and then on hover bg-blue-600, and then close this out. Inside this, we're going to be showing the send icon from Lucid React. It is going to have a class name of size-4, and then close that out. And then now for our else, so if there is no messages, we're going to return a div with a class name of flex, and then flex-1, and then items-center, justify-center, bg-gray-50, 500 with an opacity of 50, and then dark mode bg-gray-800 with an opacity of 50. And then inside this div, we're going to have another div with a class name of text-center, and then this is going to be showing the mail icon with a class name of mx-auto, margin bottom of 4, size-16, and then text-gray-400. Close this out. Below this, we're going to have an h3 with a class name of margin bottom of 2, and then text-xl, and then font-medium, and then text-gray-900. And then on dark mode, we're going to say text-white. The text is going to say select a conversation. And then below the h3, we're going to have a paragraph with a class name of text-gray-500. And then on dark mode, we're going to say text-gray-400. And the text is going to say choose someone to start messaging with. So messaging with, full stop. Now we're going to be seeing this state by default because we don't have any mutual follows. So save that. Let's see what we have on the screen. And there we go. So we are not able to test this out just yet because we need to go ahead and build some other pages. And before we get ahead of ourselves, we have some convex functions that we need to build. So we have the messages function here called get and read count. We already have that. And then we have the two functions on top, is following, users is following, right? We do have those. Now we just need to go ahead and create the get messages and mark messages as read, and then we should be good to go. We have one more here, so send message. So those three functions. So inside the messages, we're going to go ahead and say the following. On top, we're going to say export const send message, and then just copy this down because I don't want to jump back into this file. So mark messages as read, copy this and then just paste it here. And then the other one is called send message. Nope, it says called get messages. So get messages. So let's go ahead and create these three functions. So the send message is going to be a mutation and import it from /generated server. And inside the mutation, we're going to have some arguments here. It's going to be taking the sender ID, which is coming from v.id from the users table. It's going to be taking the receiver ID, which is v.id from the users table. It's going to take in the content, which is v.string. And then it takes in the images, so you can attach images which are going to be optional, so v.optional, then passing v.array, and then passing v.string, like so, because that's how they are stored. And then, oops, this should be a comma. And then our handler function is going to be as follows. So handler async, passing the context and then the arguments. We're going to say that we want to create the conversation ID regardless of who sends the message first. So const conversation ID is equal to, open this up, square brackets, arguments dot sender ID, comma, arguments dot receiver ID, and then dot sort, and then dot join, and join them using a hyphen, and then const message ID is equal to await context.db dot insert into the messages table. Messages, is that correct? Okay, then open this up. So we want to pass in the sender ID as the arguments.sender ID, pass in the receiver ID as the arguments.receiver ID, pass in the content as arguments.content, pass in the images as arguments.images, pass in the conversation ID. So you can say conversation ID as conversation ID, which we already have on top, but because they are similar in name, we can just remove the second part. Pass in the created art as the date.now, and then pass in the read as false, because when you send a new message, then it is unread by default. And then what we're going to do is return the message ID. And then the next function is mark messages as read. So mark messages as read is going to be equal to a mutation. We're going to open this up. It is going to be taking in two arguments. So it takes in the user ID, which is coming from v.id from the users table. It takes in the other user ID coming from v.id from the users table once again. And then the handler function is going to be an asynchronous function taking the context and the arguments. And then we're going to say const conversation ID once again, simply just like we have on top. So you can just copy it, paste it here, and then I'm going to say const unread messages. And is that correct? Actually, this is wrong. This should say arguments.user ID, because that is what we have in our arguments. So arguments.user ID and then arguments.other user ID. So when you're copying things, always make sure, just ensure that you're copying the correct thing. And then we're going to say const unread messages is equal to await context.db.query, and we're querying the messages table, and we're querying it with index of by conversation. Then pass in our callback function here, where we're going to say query.equals, pass in the conversation ID. And then this is going to be a bit convoluted as well. So outside of this, we're going to say dot filter, and then we want to filter query. And let me try to format it correctly so that I don't get confused. So I hate this thing sometimes. So below this, we're going to say this. Let me say q.and, and then pass in q.equals, and then pass in q.field. And then inside here, we want to pass in the receiver ID. And then outside of this bracket, arguments.user ID. And then outside of this bracket, we want to say comma, and then query.equals again. Then pass in the query.field, then pass in the read, and then outside of this, pass in false. So get all of those that are not that have not been read, and then dot collect, like so. And then we're going to say await promise dot all. Open this up, and we're going to say unread messages dot map. Then for every message that we get back, we want to go ahead and say context.db.patch, and we want to say message._id, and we want to change the read status to true. That is going to mark all the messages as read, like so. And then our next function is get messages, and probably get messages should come before mark all messages as read. And probably this one, just because of hierarchy, the way usually we do things on social media, mark messages as read usually comes last, and then get unread count, because we need this for the UI, we need this also for the UI, and then this is our first function to send the messages. So get messages is equal to a query, and takes in the arguments here as user ID, v.id coming from the users table, and then other user ID, v.id coming from the users table. And then our handler is going to say async, passing the context and then the arguments. And then we're going to say const conversation ID, which is something that we've done here. So let me copy it. And why is this not highlighted? Oh, it's supposed to be passed here. So here we wanted to pass in the conversation ID. That's the reason why. And then just let me confirm if I did the same thing. I made the same mistake here. So conversation ID. Okay, and then let's see. Here it is being used. Okay. So let's go ahead and say this. Paste that in, because that is the conversation ID. The arguments are correct, so we have no problem with that. And then we're going to say const messages is equal to await context.db.query, and we're querying the messages table. and we're querying it with index of by conversation, and then passing our callback function here. And then we're going to say query.equals, passing the conversation ID, comma, conversation ID, and then we want to order them in ascending order, and then we want to collect all of them. And then we're going to say return await promise.all. Open this up. We want to map over the messages, so messages.map, and then async. For every message that we get back, we're going to say const sender is equal to await context.db.get, passing the message.sender ID, and then we want to go ahead and return, open this up, return every detail about the message and then the sender as well. And that is our function to get the messages. So you can save that. Our message should be complete, but once again we can't really test it out until we have built another page. So the next page that we want to build is the profile page. I want to save the communities page for the last one because it is a huge page as well. It is even bigger than the messages page, and the messages page is on line 374. So it is quite a huge file. So next, let's go ahead and deal with our profile page. And the way that we're going to handle the profile page is the profile goes into the / profile and then the username of that person. So we're going to create a new file here called profile / and then the dynamic page is called username. So inside square brackets username and then / page.jsx, and then inside this file is where we're going to be building our profile page.